Right, so we are just going to get started in a few moments. Welcome. Thank you for coming out tonight to Farm Bill Fault Lines, Climate and the Farm Safety Net. If you would like to drop some information in the chat, you can tell us where you're joining from, your farm name, or what brings you here tonight. And we also have a little bit of an icebreaker question. And feel free to include this information in the chat as well. So if Congress added one thing to the next farm bill that resolves one of the biggest farm challenges you or your community face, what would you want it to be? And part of the framing of that question is the reality is that there are big financial and political constraints that are preventing incorporation of our dream programs and policies into the farm bill. But part of the focus of this webinar tonight is to be able to tell our stories and educate our legislators about all of the things that we'd like to see in the farm bill that are not currently getting funded because of how many resources go towards the farm safety net. So again, that icebreaker question, and thank you for Hagen for dropping it in the chat, is now in the chat. So if Congress added one thing to the next farm bill that resolves one of the biggest farm challenges you or your community face, what would you want it to be? Okay, well, thank you all for your patience as we navigated tech issues that are somehow still emerging even several years into this new virtual world that we live in. All right, and as I mentioned, we are here tonight for Farm Bill Fault Lines, Climate, and the Farm Safety Net. This is a presentation today that's being co-hosted by PASA Sustainable Agriculture and MIFS, Michigan Food and Farming Systems. And we will tell you a little bit more about the organizations, a little bit more about the presenters before we dive into the content. So PASA Sustainable Agriculture, for the folks that are joining us from the Michigan area, is a Pennsylvania-based association of farmers and change makers. We have a range of service offerings that go from apprenticeship programs where we run a diversified vegetable and a dairy grazing apprenticeship program. We have several farm-based research projects where farmers work as citizen scientists and submit research about their farm finances and their soil health. We also do work in the policy space, and we work with, we have a farmer-to-farmer education and events, much like this. And we have a farmer outreach team as well that works on the ground to connect with farmers and provide technical assistance, both in accessing USDA programs and also in implementing climate smart practices.
Hi, folks. My name is Hagen Kappenhurst. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the field organizer with Michigan Food and Farming Systems. We are a statewide nonprofit in Michigan that works with beginning and underserved farmers, mostly in supporting them navigating USDA programs. We also directly advocate for and support farmers in advocating for changes to programs that better support beginning and underserved farming communities. We steadily follow the logic that farmers know best their challenges and communities. And so a lot of our work is guided and administered largely by the farmers in our network. My work more specifically is elevating the needs and priorities of Michigan farmers in the Farm Bill and supporting farmers in increasing their direct representation in the creation and revision of federal ag policy. So we are on the call today to share a little bit more about some key issues around Farm Bill are myself and Lindsay with PASA and Abigail Appelman. And with our time, we will offer an overview and status update on the Farm Bill. We'll chat a little bit about the farm. I don't know why I emphasize little bit, because that's the core of this whole thing. We'll talk a lot about the farm safety net, who it serves, and some consequences of the way that it currently operates. and we'll chat about some stories, share some stories on how the current system disincentivizes conservation and smaller scale diversified operations. And we'll also share a quick and easy tool to take action on the Farm Bill today on the call, if you would like, or later if you prefer. And then we'll wrap up with some time for questions. And feel free as we go to use the chat box and the Q&A box, whichever works best for you, to add questions and to bank them, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So first, a bit of a Farm Bill overview and status update. We'll start with the bolts for folks who are just coming on board to Farm Bill, and also folks who might need a little bit of a refresher. So the question that everyone is asking these days is, will there be a Farm Bill this year? So last year, just to give us some context, last year in September, the 2018 Farm Bill expired. I have to check myself because I usually say 2014 Farm Bill for some reason. Our latest Farm Bill is the 2018 Farm Bill. It expired last September, and Congress passed a continuing resolution to continue the operations of the 2018 Farm Bill, which means that we are operating with programs that are going on 6 years old. So that continuing resolution will expire this September 2024, and it's looking more and more unlikely that we will have a Farm Bill this year before the next administration. By the end of summer, things will be shifting focus largely to elections, and Farm Bill progress will likely be stalled even further. And a lot of things have stalled it so far, one of which we're focusing on today, and that's a bit of conflict in Congress as to where limited Farm Bill funding should be allocated, which programs should be prioritized in spending. We do have some general concerns about not passing a Farm Bill this year, and so we're hoping to keep pushing our members of Congress to stick to their timelines and push forward a bill with as much force as they can before the next administration. And some of those uncertainties and concerns about not passing a Farm Bill this year is, of course, that uncertainty with a new administration. We're not sure who we'll be working with next year, and therefore we're not sure how negotiations will continue to fall out. We're also, as I mentioned, continuing with programs and spending that's outdated and isn't updated to current needs. And then we also need to keep the ball rolling, and we want to ensure that conversation and advocacy in support of key programs does not stall before it's time to pass the new Farm Bill. So we have to keep the pressure on, and that's why we're here today, to support folks in getting up to speed and using this narrow opportunity ahead of elections to let our members of Congress know our priorities in the Farm Bill. So roughly every 5 years, Congress goes through this lengthy process of drafting and amending and voting on the Farm Bill. And I say roughly because sometimes it's passed on time, sometimes it takes a bit longer. We are in a case where it takes a bit longer. There's no need to fully understand each of these steps on the screen. Just know that there are many steps involved in getting a Farm Bill passed. And lots of activities among different groups in Congress. And we are currently at the start of this process, at that very top, where each committee, the House Agriculture Committee and the Senate Agriculture Committee, are working on their own versions of the bill. And that is before it goes through this process of review, revision, and voting, and before it hits the president's desk for a signature. Currently, the House Agriculture Committee, it has stated that they are determined to release their draft of the bill sometime in May or before Memorial Day, and the Senate's a bit further behind. So there's still a lot to go in that process beyond those initial drafts from each committee. So odds aren't great that we'll see a Farm Bill this year. But the good news is that means there's lots of opportunity for continued advocacy. So what are we advocating for? What's in it for us in this farm bill? So what's on the screen right now is a pie chart of projected spending for the 2018 Farm Bill. And as you see, despite its name, most of the Farm Bill budget is actually in nutrition. And it might seem outside, but it merely reflects huge wage gaps in the US population, and the vastness of hunger and nutrition challenges in the US. So about 70% of the Farm Bill budget is allocated to nutrition. Many of you are likely familiar with the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, which is a really big program in that bucket or that piece of the budget pie. The next biggest slice is crop insurance. So most of this, and I'll let Lindsay go into more detail on this front, but most of this funding is allocated to the largest 10% of commodity growers in the US. And there are current challenges with ensuring that spending doesn't go unhinged in crop insurance for commodity growers. And there are no means tests, so no caps on your income to be able to receive premium subsidies, and no payment limits, so no limits to how much you receive for those subsidies. And Lindsay will share a bit more about that as we go. The next slice of this budget pie is commodities. So this includes programs that give price supports to a very narrow list of commodity growers, and mostly holds up the country's largest commodity farms. And then the last two smaller buckets of funding are conservation and this miscellaneous title. And that miscellaneous title is something of a catch-all, from horticulture to credit to research, and several other programs in between. So next, I wanted to share a bit about programs in the Farm Bill that are important to the success of all farmers, and not just those with the most land and wealth. So some of these areas of the Farm Bill, these subject areas, have programs offering direct support to farmers, including conservation, farm safety net, research, and local food systems. So I'll give a brief overview of each of these so you have a little bit of context and understanding of what's included. So in conservation, which I mentioned before is one of those slices of the Farm Bill budget, it includes working lands programs that some of you may be familiar with, and those offer cost share supports to farmers to help them support ecologically friendly practices on their farms. And this might include, as pictured on the slide, riparian buffers or high tunnels, which you can apply for through programs like the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. That's the program that has the High Tunnel Initiative, and the Conservation Stewardship Program. The next area that offers that direct-to-farmer support is the farm safety net. So this covers a couple of different slices of that Farm Bill budget pie, including those commodity subsidies, crop insurance, and credit. So these are the programs that support farmers through hardship and market volatility and any naturally caused losses to crops. Another area that supports farmers directly in the Farm Bill is the area of research. So this includes key programs like the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, and that supports farmers in conducting firsthand on-the-ground research. And then this last area that I wanted to highlight is the local food systems area of the Farm Bill, which includes programs that support local agriculture marketing and processing and distribution. And it also includes a direct-to-farmer grant, the Value Added Producer Grant, which supports producers in creating or developing value-added producer-owned businesses. I also highly recommend INSAC's Growing Opportunity Guide. It gives, I'm gonna pop it in the chat over here. It's a really nice guide to support you in navigating some of these programs in the Farm Bill, especially if you are a farmer on the call. So for today, we're just going to focus mostly on these top two issue areas, and that's conservation and the farm safety net. But before we go further into these issues and where negotiations stand on the Farm Bill, we think it's really important to address the roots and the history of the Farm Bill. So the US food system was entirely built on stolen land and labor, from unfair treaties that forced native tribes off their lands to enslavement of African people that led to large benefits for white landowners at the expense of Black and brown farmers. So in the 1930s, agricultural practices and overproduction contributed to the Dust Bowl. And the first Farm Bill responded to this, or the foundations of the first Farm Bill responded to this in the New Deal by paying farmers to reduce production and remove intensive crops from eroded and vulnerable land. And this largely benefited landowners with larger farms. So what this leads to is structuring of programs and policies that don't do well at accommodating farmers in growing at small scales, in diversifying their operations, and increasing conservation on their farms. So now that we understand what brought us here to these challenges with navigating these programs in a way that best supports all farmers and not just the top 10% of farmers in the US, I'm not sure how I structured that sentence, so I wasn't sure where to go from there. But we need to know who's writing it so that we can proceed with understanding how to respond to these issues in the Farm Bill. So who's writing it and why haven't they finished? For Pennsylvania folks on the call, it's Representative Glenn G.T. Thompson, and he is the chair of the House Agriculture Committee, as well as Senator John Fetterman, and he is a member of the Senate Ag Committee. For us Michiganders on the call, our chairperson of the Senate Ag Committee is Senator Stabenow, and a member of the House Agriculture Committee is Representative Slotkin. So these are 4 members of Congress whose responsibility it is to ensure that the Farm Bill is representative of their constituents, i.e. our needs. So for months, we've been hearing that members of Congress, especially Representative Thompson and ranking member of the Senate Agriculture Committee, Bozeman, are wanting to increase commodity supports in the Farm Bill. And those supports would likely come at the cost of some of those bigger pots of money that we saw in the Farm Bill budget. So that's the nutrition title. And then another large pot of money that came through the Inflation Reduction Act, and that's climate smart conservation practice support funding. More recently, though, so initially we were hearing that these programs that we really care about had a target on their back to increase commodity supports. But more recently, we're hearing from Representative Thompson that money will not come from conservation or from the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So that signals to us that our advocacy and our pressure on these issues is actually working. And it's important that we hold him to this as well. So it's a win, but not a win that we necessarily give up on. And it's important that we continue pressing these high priority issues to our members of Congress so that they maintain these stances of protecting the programs that really matter. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Lindsay to share a bit more about the key issues that are at the core of Farm Bill negotiations.
Thanks for all that really helpful context, Hagen. I realized in my fluster about the chat snafu that I never introduced myself. I'm Lindsay Shapiro. I work as PASA's Farm Bill campaign organizer, so I get farmers involved in the Farm Bill reauthorization process. I also operate a small diversified veggie farm about an hour outside of Philadelphia and have benefited tremendously from a number of Farm Bill programs, including NRCS's EQIP program, the Conservation Stewardship Program, FSA microloans. I have an FSA mortgage. My farmers market benefits tremendously from both SNAP and the Farmers Market Nutrition Program. So the programs that we're talking about today are, very, very near and dear to my heart. And I would love to see an agricultural system in which, much broader network of farmers could benefit from these programs like I have. So that has been my my mission over the past 2 years in doing this work with PASA. So with that introduction, I'm going to spend a little bit more time diving into the farm safety net. So as Hagen mentioned earlier in the presentation, the farm safety net, as defined by the USDA, is intended to protect farmers facing financial hardship. So we know that farming is an incredibly volatile business, plagued by problems that are often outside of the farmer's control. The tools of the farm safety net, which include crop insurance, commodity supports, and ad hoc disaster assistance, are supposed to prevent financial catastrophe. But as we'll see throughout this presentation, the farm safety net is actually a powerful tool for keeping the status quo as it is. And I don't want to spend too much time on how the farm safety net works, mostly because I'm totally unqualified to do so. But I think it's helpful to know in broad terms what these programs are. So with crop insurance, farmers receive government subsidies to offset the costs of their crop insurance premiums, and they purchase that insurance through a private insurer. So plans and coverage types vary, but speaking in broad strokes, farmers receive payments when their production is less than the yields or revenues that they've insured. Commodity payments, which are housed in Title I of the Farm Bill. So sometimes in Farm Bill lingo, people will refer to the titles, Title I being commodity payments, Title 11 being crop insurance. So Title I commodity payments go towards 20 or so covered commodities, and the two main programs are called ARC and PLC. When you hear news about Congress wanting to raise reference prices, PLC specifically is a program that they're referring to. And so in these programs, payments are made to producers when prices or yields drop below certain thresholds. Since 2018, Congress has authorized a whole slew of ad hoc disaster assistance through supplemental appropriations. And some of those programs, these acronyms may sound familiar to you. CFAP, ERP, I don't know if people say ERP or ERP, but WIP, there's a whole host of supplementary disaster assistance programs to kind of fill in some of the gaps that the farm safety net leaves behind, although those programs don't necessarily fill the gaps that we've been advocating for. So you've been noticing a trend here. If you farm corn or soybeans, canola, large commodities, you have some options for support if things really go sideways. And things really going sideways is a likelihood that grows with every passing season as climate change intensifies. But if your operation is diversified or you grow largely specialty crops, these programs don't have much to offer you. Okay, so spending breakdown. How much do these programs cost? Ultimately, the farm safety net has cost taxpayers more than $88 billion from 2017 to 2022. That number is actually a low-end conservative calculation. It doesn't include assistance distributed to territories of the United States, subsidies paid to private insurance companies and agents for administering the crop insurance program, or 2022 ARC and PLC payment data, which wasn't available when these numbers were compiled in February. The total number balloons to more than $142 billion over that 5-year period when subsidies distributed to farmers through the Market Facilitation Program and the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, some of those ad hoc disaster programs I was talking about, are added. And so these programs dwarf the budgets of critical programs like value-added producer grants and the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education SARE program, the Office of Urban Ag and Innovative Production, and even reasonably well-funded programs like we get in through the conservation title. Conservation programs also have means tests tests and payment limits and provisions to keep farmers from double dipping or benefiting from similar programs. There are a few comparable provisions to steward responsible taxpayer spending for the farm safety net programs, despite a significantly larger price tag. So there are no means tests or payment limits for crop insurance premium subsidies. And when I say means tests, so for if you were to apply for a program through NRCS or even the commodity supports, you're not eligible for those programs if you make more than $900,000 a year. The crop insurance program doesn't have any of those eligibility restrictions when it comes to adjusted gross income. I should also note, yeah, that's the $900,000 a year is your AGI. So that is, after your farm expenses are taken out, that's the income. That's your your take home income as reported on your taxes. So the crop insurance program doesn't have any of those. And it also doesn't have any limits on the amount of support that you can receive through premium subsidies or indemnity payments. And the limits to Title I commodity programs are rendered ineffective by loopholes. So a 2020 rule allowed family farms, which are 98% of farms, family farms do not need to be actively engaged in farming to receive Title I subsidies, which in theory makes cousins, nephews, etc., eligible without stepping foot on the farm. Meanwhile, in conservation land, roughly 3 out of every 4 farmers who applied to CSP and EQIP were turned away due to a lack of funding between 2020 and 2022. So even with IRA funds available, beginning the Inflation Reduction Act funds being available in 2023, new reporting shows that this trend of these really popular conservation programs being oversubscribed is continuing. So this is a map that shows the farm safety net total fund allocation by state, with those dark blue colors being the colors that indicate where the bulk of the resources are being spent in the farm safety net. So 61% of the $88 billion went to farms in 10 states: Texas, North Dakota, Kansas, South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, Nebraska, Missouri, and California. Farms in Texas and North Dakota alone received 21% of all of those farm safety net funds, or $18 billion. And that resource distribution appears to correlate more closely to acres planted to covered commodities than the number of farms in the state or even the value of production. So it's really a reflection of the priorities of our food and farm system to maximize production of these commodities that we then use as inputs, or they're exported, versus supporting the farms that grow food for their communities in a more kind of direct sense. America's largest 10% of farms, as Hagen mentioned, with the highest crop sales, receive almost 65% of crop insurance subsidies. And so we see this farm safety net being an incredible investment of taxpayer dollars, and those resources being concentrated in certain geographic areas. But beyond that geographic concentration, we also know that the concentration is geared towards those covered commodities. So heavily subsidized crop insurance and commodity programs were supposed to replace the previous system of disaster assistance. But these programs clearly aren't working as they were intended. Meanwhile, farm operations with shorter supply chains and more on-farm crop and livestock diversity that are leveraging direct-to-consumer marketing are more resilient to both climate and market volatility. And despite this demonstrated resilience, these farmers remain largely unsupported by farm safety net programs. But low enrollment in crop insurance policies among smaller and diversified producers doesn't reflect a disinterest in participation. We have a lot of farmers in our network that have tried to apply for the whole farm revenue protection program or the micro farm program, but haven't been able to find an insurance agent to write a policy for those programs. So there's definitely interest in some sort of farm safety net that goes beyond a GoFundMe page in the face of catastrophe. But there are just too many barriers to accessing these programs. So and I should also note on the map, we saw the concentration of resources in the center of the country there, but I want to emphasize that smaller diversified farms are still left behind, even within the states which benefited most from farm safety net programs. And a lot of the information that Hagen and I are presenting today in terms of the numbers here are provided with support from the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, and specifically this a report that they released in February about the state of the farm safety net. And I will drop a link to that in the chat, because if you want to get deeper into the farm safety net, it is a very riveting read. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Hagen to share one of the farmer stories that's featured in the farm safety net.
Thank you, Lindsay. And as Lindsay mentioned, even in states like Michigan with large enrollment in microfarm, I believe it's specifically microfarm, but whole farm revenue protection, and those programs that are more tailored to smaller scale diversified operating systems, there are still farmers who really struggle to manage and access and use those programs. Alex Ball couldn't join us today, but is featured in the Farm Safety Net report. He's a farmer in Romulus, Michigan, and he runs a vegetable farm. And despite maintaining a diversified system in terms of crops and market avenues, and increasing his on-farm resilience in the face of climate change, it's still hard for farmers like him to access crop insurance. He noted that small farmers don't just lose money after disasters, they also lose labor and wages as they hurry to replant those lost crops. He also opted not to purchase microfarm insurance, one of the few insurance options available to small scale diversified operations, specifically due to the cap on annual revenue increases. So the program has a 35% ceiling to annual revenue expansion, which is really hard for beginning farmers to stay within when their starting revenue is quite small. So I invite you, oh, thank you, Lindsay, for putting that in the chat. I invite you to read more about Alex's story and many other incredible farmers around the nation who contributed to this report in Unsustainable with that link that Lindsay just dropped in the chat. And I will pass it to Lindsay to share more about the deeper consequences of how the farm safety net currently operates.
I foolishly clicked the link that I had dropped in the chat for the farm safety net report. And I don't know, are you, Hagen, seeing the farm safety net report in a PDF form?
Yes, we are seeing the farm safety net.
Okay, let me stop sharing real quick while I get my screen back in order.
I am also happy to pick up sharing if that's helpful.
Let's see. I think we should be back on track.
I hope folks appreciated the sneak peek of the safety net report.
Yes.
Perfect. We're back.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to now spend a little time talking about what some of the consequences are of this concentration of resources within the farm safety net that goes specifically towards large and industrialized farms. So I think this is a quote from that farm safety net report. In pursuit of efficiency, the farm safety net has shifted the burden and cost of risk mitigation away from building on-farm resilient production systems. And so when we think about this tension between the farm safety net and conservation practices, this shifting of risk from the production systems to the taxpayer is one of the biggest obstacles that we're seeing in terms of moving more farmers towards agroecological approaches. And so again, climate is climate resilience is one of the main tensions that we're seeing in how the farm safety net currently operates. And so I want to take a moment to discuss the concept of moral hazard. In economics, a moral hazard is a situation where an economic actor has an incentive to increase its exposure to risk because it does not bear the full costs of that risk. For example, when a corporation is insured, it may take on higher risk knowing that its insurance will pay the associated costs. So there's an extensive body of research into the degree of moral hazard the farm safety net inspires for large industrial operations to engage in more risky practices. And so the farm safety net is not designed to incentivize the adoption of more sustainable practices that can improve climate resilience and therefore lower the risk of these operations. In fact, as we'll hear from Abigail, the systems we have in place can actively disincentivize sustainable practices, making it harder to implement conservation methods while participating in the farm safety net. And we also know that really massive monoculture operations are inherently more at risk to pests and disease outbreaks. They don't have the diversification that steeps so many of our operations in resilience. They are forced to rely on inputs and heavy equipment, and their depleted soils can often lead to increased erosion, which is already threatening yields and will continue to get worse. One of the other really striking impacts of an inequitable farm safety net is farmland consolidation. So we know that the resource concentration that we're seeing with the farm safety net is a driving factor in the growing consolidation of farmland and the acceleration of rural depopulation, by virtue of placing new, small to mid-sized, limited resource and marginalized farmers at a competitive disadvantage when it comes to buying land. So research ties the rising value of cropland to rising farm subsidies as some landowners adjust prices to capture more government payments. So instead of equitably directing limited funding toward enhancing and expanding programs that help consumers purchase nutritious fruits and vegetables that reduce cost or alleviate rural poverty, or support farmers actively engaged in farming and selling direct to market, we continue to invest primarily in a farm safety net that concentrates subsidies into the hands of the largest and highest income commodity farms, which arguably need financial assistance the least. And so, in the most recent ag census, we saw that more than 145,000 farms, that says farmers, but I think it's supposed to be farms, were lost from 2017 to 2022. So Secretary Vilsack, I think, called the recent ag census a wake-up call. We need to be doing everything we can to prevent this continuing consolidation of our farming system. And yet the farm safety net exists to do just the opposite. It is encouraging and facilitating conversation amidst the rapidly shrinking farming population. And so this graph here is an indication of the federal crop insurance indemnities, so the payouts that are made. And we see that 2022 is actually a record year for federal crop insurance indemnity. So the program paid out more in 2022 than any year prior, largely due to the impacts of climate change. So the most common causes for claims were droughts and floods. Farmers across the country are reporting greater frequency, unpredictability, and severity of droughts, floods, wildfires, frosts, and hurricanes. So we know that these farm safety net programs are only going to get more expensive in perpetuity as the climate crisis becomes more unavoidable. And so with that, I am going to hand it over to Abigail Appelman, a Pennsylvania farmer, to talk a little bit about her experiences with navigating the farm safety net and also her journey in trying to implement more conservation-oriented practices on her farm. So thank you, Abigail, for being with us tonight.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks for having me and inviting me to join you all. So as Lindsay mentioned, I'm Abigail Appelman, and I live in central Pennsylvania on a conventional crop farm. This is the farm that my family has owned, and my husband and I purchased the farm during the pandemic in 2020. Our farm has been no-till since the 1980s, and it's been mostly corn and soybeans with a little bit of hay on some of the steeper ground. And there's also some forested land here. We own just over 200 acres. We're operating just over 200 acres, which the USDA calls a small scale farm. But as Lindsay and Hagen mentioned earlier, I think that's a matter of perspective, because certainly I have lots of friends who are operating on a very small footprint, and they're just as much farmers as we are. So I began operating on the farm around 2016. And we've had some successes here that we wanted to just share in celebration, that I want to share in celebration. My husband is part of the operation. We have 0 employees, but we consider it my crop farm, and he has an operation on another farm nearby, a dairy farm. So a success, we planted our first official cover crop sometime in the 2010s. We participated in the Environmental Quality Incentives Program through NRCS to establish a cover cropping program. And so even though it's been no-till since the early days of no-till, like this was the first time it had ever been cover cropped. So we're excited about that. And as time goes on, and as we get our feet under us economically, we're diversifying the farm and adding some measured risks. So for example, we don't just have corn and soybeans, we also have honeybees and sheep and chickens and ducks, in addition to the systems that were already in place. And we really want to do other things, but the economics, like the debt to purchase a farm, and the risk associated with managing that debt, has us really locked into the current system. And I personally think that insurance could fill this gap to mitigate some of those risks. So I wanted to just bring up a couple of things that Lindsay and I had talked about in conversation in recent months, as examples of where those gaps are. So I want to say that we have some really wonderful service providers in this area. I feel really lucky to live where we do. Obviously I'm English speaking and white presenting, and so I feel like working in the local farming community has been pretty seamless. And we've got people who we know are doing a great job for us. So, this isn't to disparage anyone who's doing such a wonderful job. One of the questions that I always ask, though, is, do we really need to use treated seed? So we're small enough that we're planting late enough in the spring, that we don't have to worry about the cold, wet weather that causes seed to fail in a lot of cases. And there's other causes too, but we're really planting later, so that's not one of the causes on our farm, for the most part. And we don't see the bugs, the insect damage, other than slugs, that the seed treatment does not affect slugs. If anything, it helps them. But we want to say, let's skip the seed treatment on our corn and soybeans. And so we've run into some trouble with that because the typical seed companies won't sell untreated corn seed. It's unavailable to us. And also, there is a really significant cost to replanting a failed seed crop. So I just jotted down some numbers for myself to share with you. These are very rough numbers, but basically if we need to replant an acre, it would cost us around $160 in seed. And NRCS, through the Conservation Stewardship Program, has a payment for using untreated seed on the whole farm. And that would be about, well, last I checked, it was about $14 an acre. But so the question is, how do we balance how much seed we may need to replant, versus, and so, receiving that $14 an acre, versus using treated seed when the seed company is going to pay for the replant. So it's really a gamble, and, knowing that replanted seed on our ground is not necessarily related to the neonicotinoids and what insects they would be treating for. Um, and then another example I have is, particularly last year and into this year, we needed access to one of our fields. And so long story short, we were replanting our hay field. And so we used wheat as a nurse crop. Um, Wheat sold on the commodity market is a lot less than corn or soybeans. And so already that was a disadvantage. But we needed access to that field to replant that hay crop and harvest that wheat. So we planted the field in front of it in wheat as well. And because it was so little acreage, we chose not to insure it for the cost. And so what ended up happening was we lost a little bit of money on planting wheat instead of planting what would have been corn. So we were willing to, take on that risk ourselves. But also what happened was we lost a year of planting corn in those acres. And so there is a rolling multi-year average yield for insurance purposes. And because we missed a season of corn on that number of acreage, we actually revert to the county average, which, we have wonderful farmers in our county, and county lines are not drawn according to the soils map. And so we've got ground here in the north end of the county that is very different than the south end. And so our yields are higher. We're also located really close to a significant ridge in the Appalachian Mountains, and weather tends to follow that ridge. So go a couple miles north or a couple miles south, and the weather patterns are very different. So, we often get rain when there's drought around us because the clouds just follow that ridge. We also chose to try out a multi-species cover crop, which was really, really cool. But again, that was a cost, and we chose to do something that we thought would be great for that land instead of following the wheat with short season beans. Long season beans, but a short season for them, which would have gotten us more money to, pay the bills. And so we kind of lost in a couple different ways. One is if we need to utilize that insurance payout in a future year, in the next few years, our average yield will look lower because of the county average. And also we lost by doing something that we thought would be great for the land. So experimenting and taking risks to do what we think is better for the land is confusing, and it's hard. In fact, I just want to say again, I really appreciate the information tonight, because every time I think I have my mind wrapped around it, I figure out I have more to learn. But anyway, I have some pictures on here because I wanted to say there's so many other cool things that we want to add and adjust here on our farm and grow on a larger scale, like flax for linen fiber, or graze sheep in more of the areas on our farm, which we could do and still commodity crop if we wanted, or even transition. But because we're kind of locked into this system, we have the equipment and we have the insurance somewhat figured out, and we have conservation incentives to help us continue. It makes it a little bit safer for us to venture out of the typical corn and soybean cycle, but the cost is great. So I think I'll just wrap it up there.
Thank you so much, Abigail. It's always, just so illuminating and helpful to hear a farmer's firsthand account of how they're navigating these systems and, trying to build a business that works for their family and works for their community and works for the environment, but all the tensions and pressures that they face to do those things. So thank you so much for making time today to tell us a little bit about, yeah, what you've been experiencing in that realm. Okay, so we have been talking a lot about the farm safety net and talking a lot about the Farm Bill. And now I want to make sure that we tie those two things together so that we can move forward into next steps. So what does this all have to do with the Farm Bill? So as we discussed, federal crop insurance, commodity, and disaster assistance subsidies are a significant disincentive to scaling the voluntary adoption of conservation practices. They subsidize risky forms of commodity production, systems that are based on annual monoculture crops, overly reliant on off-farm chemical inputs, and which chronically overuse tillage. And so the style of commodity production contributes to soil erosion and climate change, and the concentration of resources in the hands of industrial farms contributed to an alarming loss of 145,000 farmers, and the trend toward farmland consolidation that we discussed in the 2022 Census of Agriculture. So this relationship, though, is rarely discussed on Capitol Hill. Instead, members of Congress hear about the important role that the farm safety net plays in helping farmers recover from disaster and revenue loss, and which, you know, we don't want people to leave thinking that, you know, the farm safety net needs to be entirely dismantled. You know, we recognize that there are a lot of farmers who depend on the farm safety net, and we, you know, want their businesses to be viable as well. However, these programs are primarily available only to a handful of farms, mostly large industrial commodity operations, and exclude most small to mid-sized diversified farmers. And then pushes from the Ag Committee members to increase reference prices are projected to benefit only about 0.3% of farms in the Southeast. And so this expensive proposal could be funded by cuts to other Farm Bill programs, namely cuts to SNAP or money allocated to conservation programs through the Inflation Reduction Act. And we also know that conservation programs are very popular among farmers and ranchers nationwide and are oversubscribed. So should Congress protect historic investments in climate-smart conservation made through the Inflation Reduction Act, or shift those dollars to further subsidize industrial commodity production? This is the fault line that has halted bipartisan Farm Bill negotiations. So, as I mentioned, some lawmakers are calling to raise commodity program subsidies by $20 to $50 billion, which would benefit just 0.3% of farms. And those programs, because we are in a budget neutral Farm Bill world, can only be funded by cuts to other Farm Bill programs. And the most likely source for those funds would be from the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program or the Inflation Reduction Act conservation and climate spending. So we need to educate members of Congress about the implications of that decision. We need to do so by shifting the narrative around how farm safety net programs influence the climate crisis. As I mentioned, Congress hears almost exclusively from large, well-funded commodity groups, and there's a perception that these programs are perfect. They are sacred cows. They should not be changed in any way. They need to be protected at all costs. And they are important, but they have far exceeded their intended purpose to be a farm safety net. And as we discussed throughout this presentation, the farm safety net picks winners and losers. It's bad for the climate, and it cannot be sustained in perpetuity the way the payments are currently being made. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Hagen to talk about taking action.
Woo! Hopefully what many of you came here for. So I realized while we continued to speak that I didn't really emphasize the importance of convening Pennsylvania and Michigan constituents, and I sort of implied it with the folks we have in the House and Senate Ag committees, but we have chairs in the House and Senate Ag committees who have an incredible amount of power in shifting and shaping the Farm Bill, which is hopefully evident through what we've shared today. And we, as Lindsay mentioned, we have also come together through the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, which has provided, I should have given credit at the top of the slides, but thank you, Lindsay, for giving that nod somewhere along the way. A lot of the information that we've been sharing today has come from their expertise and their ability to constantly keep an ear to the ground in DC to support us all in doing the work that we do. So, National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, in partnership with RAFI, which is the Rural Agriculture Foundation International. Did I get that right? I just, sorry, Rafi, if Rafi is listening. But both awesome organizations, they have put together this really simple tool for us. If you navigate, I'm going to pop that link in the chat right now. So if you navigate to this page that I just put in the chat, you will see an option to either call or email your members of Congress. And our friends have made it really simple to do. So you select which avenue you want to take, which mode of communication you want to take to reach out to your members of Congress. If you select call, they will offer you a call script. You will get a phone call from an automated system, and they will direct you to all of your members of Congress one after the other. And you can either read that script directly, or you can tailor it to fit your voice and your needs and your interests and priorities, and share that with your members of Congress. There's also a pre-written email that is offered when you select the email option on this page. And it is the simplest way to take action on this issue. And this week was, last week was conservation, not consolidation, which was the topic of everything that we addressed today. But it's not too late to make these phone calls and press on these issues. So we wanted to offer this as just sort of a reminder, a nudge to say we can keep the conversations going. Also wanted to say that while it may be, today is Tuesday, maybe a little late to schedule a meeting with your member of Congress, they are in town. This is a recess week. So there is a chance that you may be able to snag some time with them. And if not, their staffers are generally really great and attentive folks to reach out to and to have a meeting with in district. And we encourage you to share your story. And I am happy to support Michigan folks, and I assume the same of Lindsay for Pennsylvania folks in shaping your story, especially around relevant policy needs and asks that best fit your needs and priorities for the Farm Bill. And with that, I will open it up to questions for folks. You're welcome to use, it seems like the question and answer box is easiest for questions and answers. But it looked like also Vicki had a question about, so what does that say we need to focus on? Community education. Vicki, if you're able to, I don't remember when that question occurred in the presentation. And then I'm hoping that second question, what is the conversation around Farm Bill in reference to the climate crisis? I'm hoping that was answered in the latter half of the slides, or maybe the last quarter of the slides when Lindsay pieced it all together. But if there are any other nuances to that question we can fill in the gaps of, then let us know. And then if you could offer some context on that first question, that'd be great.
Great. And Yeah, I'm also curious if there are any folks that attended today, if you would be comfortable dropping in the chat, if you want to indicate if you feel like after this you're ready to use that handy tool that Hagen was talking about to call your member of Congress and let them know that you want to see a farm bill that values conservation and land access and resilient local food systems and all of the things that we would love to see in this farm bill, but are being told over and over again that there's no money for because we need to continue to fund the farm safety net at increasingly high levels. So yeah, if there's anyone in the who is feeling ready and wants to drop their commitment in the chat, that would be appreciated. I will admit that I have not done this yet. During the last week of action, I didn't actually use this tool. So I will note that I am expressing my commitment to do this. I was also told at one point a nice little trick that if you do it after hours, nobody will be there to answer the phone. But your phone call is still really impactful. They still, take note of it, but you can maybe avoid the somewhat nerve-wracking prospect of talking to a stranger. So if you want to call after hours and leave a message, that is also a really powerful way to make your voice heard without having to necessarily, again, talk to a stranger. So, and one of the things that I like to point out when I make phone calls to my member of Congress is how important conservation programs have been to me as in lieu of a farm safety net, and that I don't see myself, I don't grow commodities. I'm a specialty crop producer. And so, and there are not a lot of attractive crop insurance avenues for me. But I was able to enroll in the conservation stewardship program, and for producers who enroll, I think, as of November, December, the minimum payment amount is $4,000 per year over the course of a 5-year contract. So, that's $20,000 that's going into small farms' bank accounts in ways that the farm safety net really can't. So that's just one aspect of my story that I often like to highlight, is how integral conservation programs have been to me in lieu of a farm safety net.
It looks like there are a couple comments and questions in the Q&A box. Vicky is following up on the question about the conversation on climate change and the Farm Bill, to ask if Congress is seeing a need to increase projects and funding for climate ag insurance. I think that's how that was meant to be said. And it depends on who you're asking. So as we mentioned in the presentation, there are pretty stark divides in Congress, within both the House and the Senate Agriculture Committees on the perceived importance of the climate crisis. And it's telling to me that some folks in Congress are much more eager to put funding into riskier practices that support the much larger scale commodity growers than they are in ensuring that farmers have support in implementing climate smart practices. In my experience, also pushing for reform to those smaller insurance policies for more diversified operations like whole farm revenue protection and micro farm. There's also some general pushback from some folks in Congress and some other lobbying groups that make it really challenging to reform these programs in a way that's most supportive to producers who have not been historically well served by and currently well served by the USDA. I hope that answers your question a bit, Vicki. Feel free to follow up in the chat or Q&A if it didn't. And then re-education, taxpayers not wanting to support their food suppliers. That feels like a question beyond my level of expertise. But my go-to is there are very tangible ways that we can better support farmers in sustaining really viable businesses that allow for more engagement with community members and more development of local food systems that support consumer trust of farmers. And the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program is also really great for ensuring that not only US residents who are struggling with meeting food and nutrition needs get access to food, but also in supporting another market avenue for farmers. Also, Lindsay, not sure if there's anything you want to fill in on those questions.
Yeah, so I think in my experience, I think a lot of the customers that support my farm and farms like mine are really eager to figure out a way to advocate for a food system that better supports the farmers that are growing their food. And so part of the work that we do at PASA in some ways is to have farmers be able to tell this story and to connect with their customers around the issues that they're facing as farmers and what a fairer farm bill could look like. And so I think farmers definitely play a role in, kind of helping, making these programs feel more understandable or relatable for consumers, and farmers play a role in inspiring their customers to do the sorts of things that we're talking about today, to make those phone calls and, meet with their legislators and let their policymakers know that the farmers that are growing their food are not being adequately supported by the USDA and by government programs, and that they want to see a farm bill that does a better job of doing just that. So, we've used our farm newsletter and our social media channels to kind of help that story. And, I think the work that Hagen and I do, just tries to get farmers to be a little more comfortable being in that role of kind of like spokesperson and educator, and cheerleader for a better food system. I think that is all the questions that I see in the chat, in the Q&A. Just give one more moment in case something pops up. But otherwise, I think we are getting close to close today, and we will follow up with a few helpful links, like to that Farm Safety Net report and to this action tool, links that we shared in the chat, and hope that, this was a helpful framing of the Farm Bill fault lines, and that, you're ready to feel empowered to call your legislators. Well, thank you all very much. Hagen, do you have any parting words that you want to share?
I don't. Thank you all for committing your time today to learning and taking action if you choose to do so, or if you did during this call, and if you choose to do so after. We're in it with you. And I'm actually gonna drop my email in the chat in case anyone wants to follow up with questions or anything else. And looks like Lindsay is doing the same. Yeah, excellent. So feel free to grab those emails and send questions or any requests for support as you continue your advocacy work our way. And we appreciate you coming out.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Hagen. Thanks, Abigail.
Thank you both.